Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. T.I.M, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you, the grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. T.I.M, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. Grief does not only bring sadness, sometimes it brings anger. Not the kind of anger we are taught is acceptable, but the kind of anger that feels uncomfortable to admit. Anger at God for not intervening. Anger at faith communities that went quiet when you needed them the most. Anger at institutions that were supposed to protect, respond, or care and did not. Anger at systems that promised safety, justice, healing, or even accountability and failed. For many people, this anger is harder to name than grief itself because sadness feels expected after loss. Actually, anger does not. Anger collides with what we were taught about faith. That we should be grateful, that we should trust without question, that prayer should settle us, not stir us, that obedience means silence, and that strong belief leaves no room for disappointment. So instead of saying, I'm angry, people say, I'm just tired, I'm confused, I don't know what I believe anymore. And sometimes what they really mean is, I feel let down, I feel abandoned, I feel like something I trusted did not show up. If that's you, I want to say this clearly. Anger does not mean you have lost your faith. It often means your faith has been shaken by reality. It means you expected God to protect. You expected the church to care. You expected the system to respond with humanity. And when that didn't happen, something cracked. Well, this episode is not here to fix your beliefs. It's not here to explain suffering. It's not here to tell you why things happen the way they do. But this space is here to tell the truth. That grief can bring anger. That anger can exist alongside belief. That disappointment does not cancel devotion. And that questions do not disqualify you. We are making room today for what you were told to push down, for the frustration you pray about but feel guilty for feeling, for the silence that followed your loss, for the trust that feels abused. You do not need to clean this up. You do not need to resolve it by the end of this episode, and you do not need to come to a conclusion. You only need permission to be honest. So if your grief has changed how you pray, how you believe, or how you trust, stay here. If anger has been part of your grieving story and you did not know where to put it, this space is for you. Let's talk about grief and anger toward God, faith, and institutions without guilt and without rushing past it. Let's take a deep breath. And know that you are allowed to be here exactly as you are. Let's get started. Anger does not arrive out of nowhere in grief. It shows up because something mattered, because something was trusted, because something was expected to hold. Grief exposes expectations that we may have not even known we were actually carrying. We have expectations like, if we live right, pray hard, believe faithfully, some things will not happen to us. We also expect that God will intervene, that faith will offer protection, and we expect that institutions built around care, justice, and service will show up when it counts. When loss happens any kind of way, know that grief is not only about what was actually taken. It is also about what did not happen, what did not stop the diagnosis, what did not prevent the accident, what did not interrupt the violence, and what did not change the outcome. Anger often forms in the space between that expectation and reality. And many people do not recognize this as being grief. They think something is wrong with them because they feel frustrated instead of peaceful, irritated instead of comforted, distant instead of devout. But anger is a common grief response when loss feels unfair, senseless, and preventable. Anger shows up when there's a sense that something or someone should have done more. Sometimes that someone is God, it's the leadership, it's a system, or it's the very belief that once brought you comfort. Grief does not just break hearts, it disrupts trust. And when trust is disrupted, anger is often the emotion that carries the weight of that rupture. Now, anger can be loud, it can sound like rage, protests, or accusation, but anger can also be quiet. It can look like withdrawal, silence, numbness, avoidance, slow stepping away from prayer, community, and even participation in things. You know, some people stop going to church, they stop asking for help, and they stop just expecting any kind of care just altogether. And that doesn't mean that they stop caring themselves, but it often means caring became too painful for them. And anger can be the mind and body's way of saying, I trusted this, I believed this would be different, or I was not prepared for this kind of loss. And for many people of faith, anger feels especially threatening because they were taught that faith should stabilize grief, that belief should make pain easier, that trust should remove doubt. So when anger shows up, they assume something is broken inside of them. But anger is not a failure of faith. It is really often a sign that faith was taken seriously. You don't feel anger towards something you've never trusted. You feel anger when trust has been disrupted. Grief also strips away illusions, like illusions of control, protection, illusions that suffering follows rules. Anger arises when illusion begins to collapse. And if anger is not allowed space, it's not going to just disappear, but it simply just moves underground and it starts to turn into resentment. It can turn into shame. It can turn into distance from meaning and connection, and really a distance from yourself, from your normal personality and character. So before we talk about what to do with anger, it matters to really understand why it is actually here, why it's showing up. Anger in grief is not the enemy, but it's actually information. It tells us where the pain is concentrated. It'll also tell us where trust was placed, and it will also tell us what the loss actually disrupted. So when we listen instead of suppressing it, anger can point us toward the deeper grief that actually needs care. And that is what we will continue to explore today. Anger toward God is one of the least spoken about grief responses, not because it is rare, but because it feels forbidden. Many people were taught early on that God is not someone you question, that frustration equals disrespect, and that anger signals a lack of faith, or that doubt is dangerous. So when grief stirs anger toward God, people often turn that anger inward. They begin to judge themselves, silence themselves, and they try to pray the right way instead of praying the honest way. But grief does not erase relationship, but what it does is it exposes it, right? Anger toward God usually comes from a place of expectation and trust. So you expected protection, intervention, and you expected that prayer would matter in a very tangible way. When that does not happen, anger surfaces not because God feels distant, but because God feels close enough to disappoint you. You see, people rarely get angry at strangers. They get angry at those they trusted to show up for them. Some anger toward God can sound like this. Why didn't you stop this? Where were you when it happened? I prayed and nothing changed. I believe and still lost everything. If you are loving, why did this unfold the way that it did? These are not theoretical questions, but they are grief questions. They rise from pain and not from a place of rebellion. For many people, anger toward God also carries fear of punishment, fear of being judged, fear that honesty will cost them their connection, the relationship that they have. So instead of expressing anger, people become polite in their grief. They speak in spiritual language while their hearts are breaking underneath it. But relationship cannot survive only politeness. Anger, when acknowledged, is often grief asking to be heard more fully. So some people respond to anger by, pulling away from God altogether. So they'll stop praying, stop engaging, and stop expecting presence. Then others keep showing up, but they feel emotionally disconnected, repeating words that no longer land anywhere within their spirit. Now, it's important to understand that neither of these responses are failures. Both are attempts to survive the disappointment that they're experiencing. And anger toward God can also coexist with longing. So there's a longing for comfort. There's a longing for explanation. There's a longing for assurance that this pain is not meaningless. And you can be angry and still desire closeness. You can question and still also care. One of the most harmful messages grieving people receive is that faith should make loss easier, that belief should smooth the pain, that trust should quiet the anger. But grief does not follow theological formulas. It follows the human experience. Anger towards God is not about rejecting belief, but it is about wrestling with that reality. It's about trying to reconcile who you believe God to be with what you've just lived through. And sometimes The most honest spiritual act is not praise, but it's protest. It's not certainty. It's truth telling. It's not resolution, but it's presence with unanswered questions. You don't have to resolve your anger to be held, and you don't have to explain it to be allowed, or you don't have to rush past it to be found faithful. If anger is a part of your grief, then it deserves space without correction. God does not require you to be composed in pain. Nobody expects you to be composed in pain. If you've been cut and your leg is open, we expect you to yell, to scream, to holler, to react to what's happening, right? So the same is with your pain of grief and your pain of anger is you are allowed to become undone. Know that anger may not be the final destination, but it's often part of the journey, okay? And ignoring it doesn't deepen your faith. You don't become more holy. It often just distances people from themselves and from God. So if anger toward God has been part of your grieving story, I just want you to know that you're not alone, you're not broken, and know that you are responding to loss the way that many humans do when trust is shaken. For many people, grief does not only rupture personal faith, it ruptures trust in communities and systems that were supposed to help carry the weight. Anger toward faith, communities, and institutions often grow quietly. It does not always show up as, outrage. More often it will show up as distance. Distance from the church that went silent, distance from leaders who did not check in, and distance from systems that felt more concerned with procedure than people. This is my testimony. Many grieving people expected care, presence, or acknowledgement, and instead encountered absence or awkwardness and avoidance. No phone calls, no follow-ups, no space to speak honestly about what they were feeling. And when that happens during loss, it hurts in a very different, painful way, because institutions and faith communities do not just represent services. They represent belonging. They represent shared values, and they represent safety. So when they fail to respond with care, grief becomes layered. There is the loss itself, and then there is the loss of trust. For some people, the anger is tied to harm, being told to forgive too quickly, being told that everything happens for a reason, or being told to pray harder, believe stronger, or move on sooner. Those responses do not soothe grief at all. They often just silence it. And when people feel silence during loss, anger is a natural response. There is also anger towards systems that were meant to protect or support and did not. Healthcare systems that felt rushed or dismissive. Workplaces that expected productivity without compassion. Institutions that prioritize image, policy, or efficiency over humanity. Now, when grief intersects with institutional failure, people often feel unseen. And they ask questions like, how could you not notice? How could you not care? How could this have been allowed? And again, anger forms not because expectations were unreasonable, but because care was expected. Now, many people feel guilty for this kind of anger, and they tell themselves that they should be understanding that institutions are imperfect, that leaders are human, and all of that may be true. But grief is not managed by logic alone. Anger towards institutions often holds the pain of betrayal. It is the pain of believing a space was safe and then discovering it was not. of trusting leadership and feeling dismissed, or relying on systems and feeling reduced to a number or case. For some, the result is withdrawal. They stop attending, they stop engaging, they stop offering vulnerability, not because they no longer value meaning or connection, but because vulnerability becomes unsafe for them. Stepping away from institutions is sometimes labeled as loss of faith or commitment, but often it is just an act of self-protection. It is grief saying, I cannot carry this and also manage discomfort, right? So I'll say for me, in my own personal grief story, is I walked away from my associate pastor's position because I could not manage to carry the grief of losing my mother while also carrying the discomfort of not being able to trust my institution with what I was actually feeling. I was not able to be vulnerable and be able to walk out that my process of grieving there. And so when we think about anger toward faith communities and institutions, it deserves to be named without minimizing it, right? Because it points to wounds that are relational, not just emotional, right? And if those wounds are not acknowledged, people do not simply heal on their own. They carry the distrust forward into future relationships, communities, and also other systems. So naming anger does not mean burning bridges. It means telling the truth about what was lost. For many people, anger is not the hardest part of grief. The guilt that follows is. Anger shows up first, then comes the second voice that says, you shouldn't feel this way. You should be grateful. You should trust more. You should be further along by now. That voice does not come from grief itself, but it comes from what we were taught about emotion, faith, and strength. Many people learn early on that anger was unacceptable, that it made others uncomfortable, and that it signaled ingratitude, disobedience, or even weakness. So when anger arises during grief, it is often immediately judged. People start negotiating with themselves, saying things like, I know others have it worse, or I should be thankful for what I have, or I shouldn't be angry with God. I shouldn't be upset with the church, or I shouldn't be questioning. But guilt, it convinces people that they need to earn the right to grieve. But grief is not something you qualify for, okay? It just happens. It is a human response to loss. Guilt also creates pressure to perform grief the right way, to look faithful, to sound hopeful, to appear composed. And that pressure often pushes anger underground. And when anger is buried, it does not disappear. We mentioned this before. What happens is it turns into resentment. It turns to numbness, self-criticism, and emotional distance. So guilt tells people that feeling anger means they are failing at grief. But anger is not a moral issue. It's an emotional one. So releasing guilt does not mean celebrating anger or acting it out. But it does mean is allowing it to exist without self-punishment. Okay. It means recognizing that anger is often grief's response to injustice, loss, and disappointment. Many people confuse acceptance with silence. They believe that to accept loss, they must stop feeling angry about it. But acceptance does not mean you agree with what happened. It simply means you are no longer fighting yourself for feeling what you feel. Now, guilt will also show up when people compare their grief to others. They start to minimize their pain. and they tell themselves that they do not deserve to feel this upset. But grief is not a competition, guys. Your anger does not need to be justified by someone else's suffering. One of the most important shifts grieving people can make is this. Instead of asking, is my anger appropriate? Ask, what is my anger responding to? Anger often points to unmet needs, unacknowledged pain, broken trust, and unanswered questions. So when guilt is released, anger becomes easier to listen to. And when anger is listened to, it often softens its own or on its own. Not because it was forced to, but because it was finally allowed. So you are not required to be at peace with loss in order to heal. You are allowed to move through grief honestly. So letting go of guilt does not mean you stop caring about faith, meaning, or community. It simply means you stop pushing yourself for being human. Many people believe the goal of grief is to get rid of anger, to claim it, to resolve it, to move past it. But anger does not respond well to force. When people work against anger, they often tighten around it. They argue with themselves. They rush toward forgiveness or understanding before they are ready. And they pressure themselves to feel differently. And working with anger actually looks different. Okay. It begins with allowing anger to exist without needing it to leave right away. Okay. Anger does not need a solution to be valid. It needs acknowledgement. One way to work with anger is through honest language, not polished language, but honest language, not spirituality, impressive language, but with real words. It may be something like, I'm angry and I do not know what to do with it. Or I'm frustrated and I feel unheard. Or I'm tired of trying to make sense of this. Whether those words are spoken aloud, written down, or held quietly, honesty matters. It always matters. Another way to work with anger is through the body. So anger lives in the body as much as it lives within your mind. So tension in the jaws, tightness in the chest, restlessness, fatigue, right? All of those things happen. So gentle movements like breath or grounding can really help anger release without being suppressed, not to make it disappear, but to give it somewhere to go. Anger also needs witness, not people who were corrected, but people who were rushed to, and not people who were rushed to explain it, but it actually needs people who can listen without trying to fix it. This might be a counselor, a spiritual caregiver, a trusted friend who can hold space, without the discomfort. Anger often will soften when it no longer has to defend itself. And another important part of working with anger is also giving yourself permission to speak, to step back, right? So step back from practices that feel hollow, step back from spaces that feel unsafe, and then step back from expectations that require you to perform healing. And this is not about giving up, but it is listening to what you actually need as you go through this process. And sometimes anger is telling you that something needs rest, or there's some distance, there's some change that needs to happen. And working with anger also means getting curious about what is underneath it. Anger often protects grief. It shields sadness, fear, disappointment, or even longing. So you might ask yourself gently, what pain is this anger guarding? What was taken that still hurts, and what did I need that I didn't receive? So you do not need to answer these questions quickly, okay? But anger will unfold in its own time, right? So there is no deadline for understanding it. There's no requirement to transform it into something more acceptable. Just know that when anger is met with patience instead of pressure, it often becomes less overwhelming to deal with, not because it disappears, but because it is no longer alone. So working with anger is an act of self-respect. It says that my experience matters even when it's messy. And when anger is treated with care instead of resistance, it can become a doorway rather than a barrier. And in these final moments of this episode, we will bring everything we have talked about together to create space to breathe without answers. As we close this conversation today, I want to leave you with this, that grief has a way of changing how we relate to everything that we once trusted, right? It changes, to God, to faith, to community, systems, even to ourselves, right? And if anger has shown up in your grief, it doesn't mean that you failed. What it does mean is that something actually mattered deeply. It means that your trust was real, and it means lost touch more than one part of your life. And you do not need to resolve your anger to be worthy of care. And you don't need to explain it to be allowed space to experience it. And you don't need to rush toward peace to prove anything to yourself or to anybody, right? Know that anger is not a detour in grief, but it is often part of the road. It is part of the journey. There may be days when your faith feels quiet, days when prayer feels distant, or days when institutions feel unsafe, and days where meaning feels unclear. Those days do not define you. They are moments within a larger story of learning how to live after loss. You are allowed to take your time. Know that you are allowed to change your mind, and that you are allowed to rest right where you are. If all you can do right now is tell the truth about how you feel, know that that is enough. So as you move with your day, I want to invite you to breathe, not to calm yourself, not to fix anything, just to remind your body that it is allowed to exist in this moment. You are not alone in this. You are not wrong for what you feel, and you do not have to carry grief in silence. Thank you for sitting with me in this space today. And until next time, remember you have permission to breathe. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. If today's episode met you where you are, I hope you carry that steadiness with you as you move through the rest of your day. Remember, you do not have to rush what you are feeling, and you do not have to have it all figured out. You can also read the blog that coincides with this episode every Wednesday at drtammyisaac.com, where I continue the conversation and offer space for reflection in a different way. If this podcast has been helpful, please feel free to share it with someone who may need permission to breathe too. Until next time, take care of yourself, one breath at a time. I'm Dr. Tammy Isaac.